Alrighty, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our, I think, third honors colloquium here of the fall semester, the very long 2020 that we're in, but we're very excited today to have a presentation by Dr. Abbie Strunc, Assistant Professor of Education. As it is almost election day, she is going to be talking to us on America's favorite three-ring circus, electing a president. So I will turn control over to her, and she will guide us through a discussion of elections and the Constitution and such like. And then hopefully there'll be some time for questions afterwards. So Dr. Strunc, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And before I get started, I want to provide just a little bit of background about this presentation. So last spring, when maybe it was 2 springs ago at this point, we were looking at a place theme, and several of our students asked to consider politics, presidential elections. They wanted more information about voting and how they could learn about the candidates, how they could make informed decisions. And so we ended up going with a different theme for place that year. And then of course, this year we have the Southern Experience. So I wanted to offer this presentation, and so it may not be quite what you're expecting. I'm going to talk a little bit about political parties. I'm not going to go through in a lot of great detail about what the 2 dominant political parties and then the 2 other parties that you'll see on the ballot in Texas might believe, but just to kind of give an overall idea. And then I want to provide some resources for information for your own personal research, for how you can find some digestible, nonpartisan sources to help you think about your perspective in American politics. And then we're going to wrap up with a little bit of discussion of Article 2 of the Constitution and the Electoral College. So let me get started, and please feel free. This can be very much a conversation. So if you have questions, it is quite all right with me if you want to ask them. Okay, so ring 1 of our 3-ring circus are the political parties. And in the United States, we have a very much a 2-party system. A lot of that has to do with the Electoral College and the way that support is given, money, a winner-take-all system that we'll get to in ring 3. And so our 2 main political parties that you've probably heard of are the Democratic Party, founded in 1828. Their first elected candidate was Andrew Jackson. And their essential beliefs, their party platform is about 75 pages. I have a link right here at the bottom that takes you to their party platform. And I got all of this off democrats.org, but their essential beliefs are in economic reform, specifically looking at taxes, looking at government supports in terms of welfare and assistance, because they're very focused on providing a hand up and support to the middle class and upward mobility of people, which means access to home ownership that some people in the United States have not yet had the opportunity to own their own home. So they have platforms and support for those things. They're also very much in support of a government offered or a government option universal health care. They are interested in criminal justice reform in terms of sentencing lengths, equity in representation in the prison system, representation in court, and under and overrepresentation of different populations. Very focused on the protection of civil liberties and the rights of African Americans, Latinx, LGBTQ+, all sorts of, there's immigration reform is another part of that, and making legal pathways for people to become citizens or legally here. They've got all sorts of different plans for that, and they're very detailed, so I'm not going to cover all of that in great detail. They're also very interested in climate change and environmental justice, which they're worried. There's a lot of concern about climate change and environmental justice, protecting natural resources and not exploiting, overusing, or deteriorating environmental conditions any further. Very interested in educational equity in terms of public education and schooling in the United States, and providing all people a quality education regardless of their zip code. That's one of their big pushes, and those are all domestic policies. And then American diplomacy is kind of their foreign policy statement. It is much more detailed than just simply saying American diplomacy, but it's largely focused on not building up the military or military strength, but more through diplomacy and diplomatic actions. So again, you can find out much more in depth from the Democrats.org and their party platform here. The second political party that probably everyone has at least heard of is the Republican Party, founded initially in 1856. The first elected candidate to the presidency is going to be Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And the essential beliefs of the Republican Party, which is really kind of interesting, they want to rebuild the economy through tax reform, international trade reform, and freeing up financial markets. So when we compare, if we did a side-by-side comparison of the Republican and the Democratic Party platforms, what you'd see is that some of the issues are very similar. Their solutions to those issues and the direction in which they want to take those particular scenarios is where the divergence happens. But there is at least consensus among the Republicans and the Democrats that the economy needs reform. There should be tax reform. There should be international trade reform. But the Democratic Party would say that that's protection of the American workers instead of international trade reform. So you can kind of see some of their leanings toward policy issues based on the language that they use. The Republican Party, in terms of reforming government, and where the Democratic Party might say expanding democracy, they refer to the rebirth of the constitutional government, which deals with voter laws, voter registration. The Democratic Party is also concerned with those issues. Where the Democratic Party says climate change, they're concerned about climate change and environmental justice. The Republican Party considers America's natural resources and offers to be representatives of agriculture, farmers, energy, and the environment. And the way that each of those parties sees the use of those natural resources in the environment differs pretty significantly. They're also looking at government reform in terms of electing candidates, term limits, things of that nature, but again, the policies are fairly divergent. And then their last platform support is Great American Families, where they discuss their options for choice in education. So they are not as singularly supportive of American public education, but rather much more interested in school choice and allowing people to use vouchers and send their children wherever they want. So kind of redistributing taxes through the voucher system, healthcare through choice and privatization, criminal justice reform. And then so those are their domestic issues, very, very broadly, not in a lot of detail. And that is really intentional on my part. If we spent time just diving into the Republican and Democratic Party platforms, that would eat up the whole hour. So their foreign policy is America Resurgent, and it's more geared toward diplomacy in sort of Teddy Roosevelt's perspective, speak softly, carry a big stick, have larger military than perhaps the Democratic Party would like to see. And you can see their party platform and more of their beliefs on GOP.com. And then this is also a link to their platform for 2020. I think it's fair to say, because this was kind of unique in my perspective, that they don't have an official Republican Party platform of 2020. Instead, at their national convention this summer, they adopted a resolution to continue with the same platform that the Republican Party created at their last national convention in 2016. And so they have the resolution as the first page, and then the next page is their 2016 party platform. That's kind of unique. So the other two parties, there are lots of parties in the United States, and honestly, there are bigger and smaller parties that are only in some of the 50 states. They're not all necessarily national, but you don't hear much about them, and they don't have support, and they often don't get on the ballot because it requires a lot of funding and support to get on state election ballots, even for local or statewide elections. But the two parties that are the two additional parties that you will see on the ballot in Texas and when I checked Arkansas as well are the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. The Libertarian Party was founded in 1971 in Colorado, and they have essential beliefs that include promoting civil liberties, non-interventionalism, meaning they don't want the government to intervene in pretty much anything. They believe very strongly in laissez-faire capitalism, which is it's not just a free market system. It's really that there aren't governmental supports in the economy. So it's just let the economy be what it's going to be. And there really aren't very many examples of a true laissez-faire economic system in the world today that we could look at. The closest one might be Hong Kong, but even then it's not completely laissez-faire. And they also believe in the abolition of the welfare state. So the interesting thing about the Libertarian Party is that they don't like centralization so much that they don't have a very strong, even though they're running a candidate, Joe Jorgensen, who is running for the Libertarian Party, they don't have a national centralized, like National Libertarian Party. If you go to the second website down there, it's mylp.org, it'll ask you to find candidates in your particular state, even though they are running a candidate for the presidency. So they are very decentralized in terms of political parties. And that can also be one of the reasons why it's hard for some of these other third-party candidates to get on the ballot across the United States. But I think in almost all 50 states in the District of Columbia, Joe Jorgensen has managed to get on the ballot. The second third party that you'll see on the ballot is the Green Party. And all of the history, because the Green Party's been around, and all of this history comes from the Green Party's website that I'm about to say. But the Green Party was a movement that was first formed and really took hold and action in the United States in May of 1984. But it wasn't until and so there were other Green Parties that popped up in other states in the US, but it wasn't really until the mid-1990s that the Green Party organized at a national level. And so it was very hard for them to get on the ballot nationally as well. But they have 10 essential beliefs that they focus on: grassroots democracy, and that's one of the reasons why they are not as structured nationally as the other two, Republicans and the Democrats, because they believe in grassroots democracy where it starts locally and builds from there. They believe in social justice and equal opportunity, ecological wisdom, nonviolence, decentralization of the national government or government authorities, community-based economics, feminism and gender equity, respect for diversity, personal and global responsibility, and with a future focus and sustainability. So you can see even in these two third parties that there are some elements of beliefs from the Republican and the Democratic Party, and you could probably identify where if someone left because they were disenchanted with the Republican or the Democratic Party and didn't want to switch sides, so to speak, to the other party, you could see where they might find a home in one of these two third parties. So we have lots of information. What does this mean? Well, let's go to ring 2, which is all about voter information. And so how do you take all of these candidates, all of this information? We are winding up right now the end of the general election. And even though we've been talking about the presidential election for the last year and a half, 18 months for sure, the general election doesn't officially begin until September of an election year because the candidates for the presidency aren't official until after the national conventions of the Republican and the Democratic Party. The primary system has become since 1968 when the Democratic Party started primary reforms. It's become longer and longer. And so we have what we call a front-loaded election cycle. So we've heard about this for a long time, but really it's just September and October. Tonight at 8 o'clock Central Time is the last presidential debate on most major networks. You should be able to find it pretty easily, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And so that's one of the other things that we see as a result of the two-party system is that we haven't seen, even though on the ballot in Texas and in Arkansas, you'll see a Green Party candidate and you'll see a Libertarian Party candidate. They've not been present at these debates. It's just been Biden and Trump. So it's hard to wade through all this massive quantity of information to figure out who might be a candidate that you would have the most that you could find in common, because we have a representative democracy. We elect leaders based on the idea that they agree with us or we agree with them and their policy stances for most issues, not all. I've never found a candidate that I've agreed with on everything. So we elect these representatives to go and vote on our behalf. And we trust that when they tell us their policy stances, they're going to vote in a way that were we able to vote on all the legislation and things that happen at the state and national levels, we would vote the same way. So I'm going to stop share very quickly and go to some of these websites so that you can see what they look like. Let me come back over here to Zoom and share screen. So the first one is, does that show up for everyone? Because sometimes I get on Zoom and I am driving through websites and other people are not seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, good. So this one is really interesting because it breaks down a lot of the information. So you can take a political quiz to find out where your beliefs might be. They'll give you kind of a rundown, and they start with the first one that you can see here are healthcare issues. And so you have yes or no that you could vote with, but in the first question, should the federal government require people to wear masks in public during the COVID pandemic? That could be a yes or no, and that might be, you could be happy with one of those answers, but there are in politics, as in the rest of life, a lot of nuanced areas too. And so you have the option here to vote with certain nuances, or you can even add your own, and they will also allow you to say that this is not irrelevant and should be removed. It's really important to note that one of the reasons why I chose I side with is because this is a nonpartisan think tank that's just interested in collecting data and learning more about political opinion and political culture in the United States. And so it goes through healthcare. There are many questions that deal with healthcare issues, science issues, criminal issues, a lot of social issues that you've seen that make up these party platforms, because that's really where the Republicans and the Democrats and all political parties are supposed to get their ideas and their platform issues based on the members of their party and what they hear from their constituents and the people that they represent, whether it's a member of a political party or as an elected official. And so they give you a rundown here of important issues in the 2020 election. There we go. Hopefully y'all are seeing that and we didn't leave behind. And so you can look at the individual candidates, you can take the quiz, and gives you a lot of really great information. Another site that will help you kind of figure out where you align would be the politicalcompass.org. And I believe I have this one up here too. This one is also really interesting because it's not just a look at American politics. It's actually from a European researcher. And so they have information about elections from all over the world, but it gives you a chance to find where you stand on a political compass from a worldview, because even though the Republicans and the Democrats have very, very separate and distinct policy issues, and they don't agree on a lot of ideological stances or policy solutions, they do tend to agree on a world political spectrum, basic ways about how the government should be run and that it should still be a representative democracy. They may not agree on the solutions to the problems or how to fix these things, but then you can also, there's a website, there's a link over here specifically to the 2020 presidential election. That's pretty interesting. So it tells you, you can take the quiz and find out if you're more of an authoritarian leader. And so Hawkins is the Green Party candidate in the US and Jorgensen is the Libertarian candidate. And what I think a lot of people might find surprising is that Biden and Trump are in the same quadrant in this political compass, which is really interesting because after watching some of the debates and seeing them on the campaign trail, you might not necessarily have thought that Biden and Trump would have ended up in the same political quadrant. So it's really talking about freedom and the role of government and how much the government should control in our lives. And you see that Trump and Biden aren't as far apart as we might anticipate. So are there any questions? Can you guys see the PowerPoint again?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sometimes it doesn't work for me that way. So the other question for voter information is, where do I vote? And am I even registered to vote? So you may not know that, you may not remember. So there are options here. You can click and go to, never mind. Yeah. You can't see the PowerPoint. Okay, thank you for that. I am going to go back over here to this website and share my screen again. We're going to a different one. Thank you for letting me know that you could not see it. Okay, so how do you vote? Where do you go to vote? We're going to right here. This is it's called votetexas.org, powered by the Texas Secretary of State. And so you have several options. You can check to see if you're registered to vote. In Texas, you have to register to vote 30 days before the election. So the last day to either mail in a ballot or a voter registration card or to drop one off in person was October the 5th. But so if you live in Texas and you happen to miss that deadline, that was also the deadline for Arkansas and I want to say Louisiana, but don't quote me on that. So you can register to vote, even if you're not registered for the presidential election. Registering to vote one time in Texas, if you vote in the next available election, that renews your voter registration automatically for the next 2 years. So as long as you vote once every 2 years, you don't have to re-register to vote in Texas. You can also find out what's on the ballot, where your polling place is, what kind of ID you need to go be able to vote in Texas. You have to have a government issued ID card in the state of Texas to be able to vote. And I'm not sure about, yeah, Jacob, that's a really good question about why only the Democratic candidates are. So the short answer is it's money. You have to have enough signatures and enough support to be able to get on the ballots. And the interesting thing is that in order to get on the ballot, you have to meet the criteria in every individual state, because elections are run by the 50 states and the District of Columbia. It's not something that we have a federal election commission, the FEC, but their whole function is to ensure that they monitor campaign finance reform, because candidates can elect to take federal money that's collected, like you can donate money on your tax reform or in your tax form every year, $2, $3, $4, whatever, to the federal election campaign funds. And so the FEC functions to make sure that that campaign finance reform is followed, that the candidates are reporting all of their donations and they're following campaign contribution limits and who they can take money from and all that kind of stuff, but they don't actually oversee the elections. That's left up to the individual states and the District of Columbia. And then, so in order to get on the ballot, because the political parties, the two-party system, the political parties are the ones that are running these debates. And so without being on the ballot in enough states, then you can't get into the debate. And also it doesn't serve the Democrats or the Republicans any benefit to let these other people in, because, you know, you could, if you look at the Democrat and the Republican parties and you don't see, you know, someone that represents what you really believe, but you feel like, well, I have to pick one of them. You don't want to know that there are other options out there, because then you could decide to vote Libertarian or Green Party instead of Republican or Democratic Party. So it's not really fair. That's one of the problems with the Electoral College, is that it sort of forces us into this two-party system. And that's why there are a lot of people who would love to get rid of the two-party system. So it will take us to, let me see if there's one other website about checking to see if you're registered to vote. I wanted to share with y'all. Okay, let me go back and share my screen. I'm sorry. That's the only sort of downside to Zoom, is that it's hard to share your screen. So this is where it'll take you. It'll take you to Texas or Arkansas or Oklahoma or Louisiana, kind of depending on where you live. But this is where it'll take you to this Texas Secretary of State, and it'll help you check to see if you are registered to vote. So let me go back here to share my screen and go back to this fun little PowerPoint. Okay, so how do you know who to vote for? I mean, there's a ton of information. These party platforms, I think the Republican Party platform is about 67 pages. The Democratic Party platform was like something around 75 pages. And you can go read through all of their ideology, but then what are they going to do if elected to office? And how are they going to take those platforms and use them to create policies that solve some of the problems that have been identified? And this is where some more nonpartisan groups come in to help identify some of these issues. One of them is the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters has really great resources because they have an interactive ballot that's already pre-made. So you can use it on your smartphone or on a computer, and it'll line the candidates up, and you can click on a little info button and it'll show you. Or they have all of these great resources to show you. They have a they have a voter's guide that will take you through the issues. Now, this one is, I have to say, this one is specific to Texas. That's just where we are. So I just picked this one in particular, but it'll show you, it gives you lots of great information. It tells you the main national elections, which would be the US president. Texas is also electing a senator right now. The railroad commissioner, which is an important part of the executive in Texas. In Texas, we also elect a judiciary. So you have members of the Texas Supreme Court, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and the State Board of Education that are up for election. And that's, State Board of Education is pretty important too for public education in Texas. So it gives you a voter's guide. You can set up reminders, or they'll text you to remind you to go vote. Early voting is still open in Texas until Friday, I believe, is the last day. And it gives you options for how you can vote by mail. You had to have requested that a long time ago. So your options are, you have to vote in person at this point in time. So it gives you US president. So you can compare the candidates. I'll show you their websites, Facebook, Twitter. They ask, the League of Women Voters ask the candidates questions, and these are the responses to the candidates. Unfortunately, Donald Trump did not respond, but it gives you lots of information about Joe Biden's perspectives. Joe Jorgensen and Howie Hawkins also did not respond. But they give you the questions, and then you see the two main candidates for Senate in Texas are John Cornyn and Mary MJ Hager. So you can find out their answers to those particular issues. Carrie Douglas McKinnon, the Libertarian candidate for Senate, which you may not have known. There was a Libertarian candidate on the ballot, and then David Collins, who is also the Green Party candidate. So it goes all through these candidates. And so you have the League of Women Voters. It will also, there's a voting site called Vote 411, which can help you register to vote. This one is state, it's national, it's not individual by state. So here's a voter's guide that is specific to the state of Texas, but you can easily click and find other states as well. So, sorry, I have to move some of the screen sharing out here. But you can go to voters guides. You can go back to Vote 411 and look in your particular state and find the absentee ballot process, which is late, but you can come over here and change your state to a different one. So we could go over here on their interactive map, and let's pick Louisiana. It'll give us information about early voting, the absentee ballot process, when you vote. The deadline by mail for October 5th, and to get a ballot by mail, and also to register to vote. You can register online in Louisiana, which you cannot do in the state of Texas. It tells you the dates when there are runoffs, which will be different for every state, and gives you lots of information. So you have all of that information available to you to be able to figure out where, when, and how to vote in different states. And then one of the last places is the Texas Tribune. And the Texas Tribune is also a nonpartisan organization that sort of considers itself to be journalistic entity that's a watchdog for Texas. And so they have a lot of the same features that Vote 411 and the League of Women Voters do. All of those sources are nonpartisan. Okay, and that brings us to Ring 3, the Electoral College. And part of Ring 3 is really controlled. You see there's a ringmaster in the background here, because the Electoral College really drives a lot of what happens in the United States in terms of elections. So an important thing to know before we start is that elections in the United States are very decentralized. States are charged with running their elections. So it's not as though we have one national election. So on election day on November 3rd, there's not one national election for the presidency. There are truly 51 separate presidential elections that are going on because of the 50 states in the District of Columbia. So states are charged with running their own elections. They are charged with deciding when and how, what voter registration requirements are. They're charged with ballot counting, reporting election results. 24 of the 50 states elect their chief election official is an elected Secretary of State. That's how we have our chief election official in Texas, is through electing a Secretary of State. But other states have, and not all of the remaining 26, but other states have chief election officials that are actually appointed by their governor, so they're not even elected. It's estimated that approximately 10,000 state and local entities run state and national elections in the United States. This is part of those powers that are reserved to the states in the Constitution. And so, as I mentioned before, you have the Federal Election Commission that enforces campaign finance laws, and Congress oversees, or they try to regulate and ensure some standards. So in 1993, there's actually, the official name is different, but I always call it the Motor Voter Act, which is a nickname. And what the Motor Voter Act did was it said that all 50 states in the District of Columbia had to allow people to register to vote at the same time that they were getting their driver's license. So if you have to renew your license in any state and you go and they ask you if you want to register to vote, you should always say yes, because it's only a check mark in the box in their computer system. And then you're automatically registered to vote. So if you move somewhere and do you want to register to vote, say yes, because that gets you registered to vote in the new place where you've just moved, and you don't have to do any additional paperwork. Congress also in 2002 passed the Help America Vote Act, which provided funds to update antiquated voting systems. So some places, and even in Bowie County, I early voted this year, and it's the first time I've actually used an electronic machine to vote. Typically, when I go vote in my polling place, they give me a printed ballot and I have to take a marker or a black pen and bubble in the answer. But so that's one of the things that the Help America Vote Act did. It upgraded a lot of the state's voting machines and opportunities to be more current. So I'm not going to read all of this to you. It is in the original language of the Constitution. So this is from the US Constitution, Article 2, which establishes the executive branch of government. It's Article 2, Section 1, and it creates the Electoral College. This is the clause where the Electoral College is created. And it says that a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in the state is entitled to they have Electoral College representatives. And so it has to be people, according to the Constitution, that are not elected. They cannot currently be holding an office. to be elected or appointed as an elector in the Electoral College. So the electors meet after the general election in November. They meet on the first Wednesday after the second Monday. That's what the language says, in their respective state capitals or in the District of Columbia, and cast their ballots. And so Congress can determine the choosing of electors and the day in which they give their votes, which is what they've done with the first Wednesday after the second Monday after the general election, which is always in December. This year, it happens to be on December 14th. So what that means is these are the Electoral College votes that are available for every state in 2020. In 2024, we're going to see that number change because the census is taken every 10 years, and based on the population of each state, that's how many representatives they have apportioned to them in the House of Representatives based by population. The number for the House of Representatives is fixed at 435. Technically, they have 438, but there are 3 non-voting members of the House that are allowed from the District of Columbia. And so the number is fixed. They're not going to add more representatives to the House. So that could mean that based on population growth or loss, some states could lose and some states could gain. In 2010, Texas went from having 32 members of the House of Representatives to having 36, which gives us our current total of 38 Electoral College votes, 2 senators plus 36 members of the House, 38 votes. The only other state that has more than that would be California, and they have 53 members of the House based on their population and 2 senators. So this is where you see the breakdown. When the minimum number of Electoral College representatives is 3. You can have 1 member from the House, and every state gets 2 for the Senate. So you see up here in kind of the West and a little bit of the Midwest, there are some states that only have 3 because of their small population. All right, so what happens after November 3rd? The popular vote winners' slate of electors are chosen. So the slates of electors for the Electoral College come from the political parties. So Congress allows the political parties to pick their electors because most states operate as winner take all. So whomever wins the popular vote, that's the slate of electors that will go to their state capital December 14th and cast their ballots for the winning candidate, even if the popular vote is split very closely. So let's say in Texas, which we don't know this will happen, I'm just throwing numbers out there, okay? But let's say in Texas, Trump gets 48% of the vote and Biden gets 46% of the vote. Joe Jorgensen gets 3%, right? So the popular vote winner would be Trump in that case. So all 38 Electoral College votes, because Texas is a winner-take-all state, would go to Trump. But that does not adequately represent all of the votes cast in Texas. Same thing in California. Most of the time, historically, in the last several election cycles, California is a heavily Democratic state. So it's very safe to assume that Joe Biden will win those 55 Electoral College votes. But what if the votes for Biden were 49% for Biden, 42% for Trump, and then 5% for Joe Jorgensen or 3% for Howie from the Green Party? That's not a super majority, that's more of a plurality, but California is a winner-take-all state too. So all 55 of those Electoral College votes would go to Joe Biden, which doesn't adequately represent all of the votes cast in California either. But so these Electoral College representatives, each political party typically chooses them. Every state, because election law really belongs to the state and a lot of election policy is done at the state level. Every state gets to decide how they pick their slate of electors. Most of them wait until their state conventions before they pick their slate of electors, but they have to have a list that's sent to the archives, the National Archives in Congress, actually. Let me check. I see I might have some questions. Oh, nope. I need to go back because I'm not quite finished here. I can't get the chat to open. Okay, sorry, I'll come back in just a minute. So most of these states are winner-take-all system. The only two states that are not winner-take-all that actually use the representative or fractional distribution method of their votes are Maine and Nebraska. Maine has 4 electoral college votes and Nebraska has 5. So even though they could divide, they can and they do divide up their electoral college votes by the percentage of popular votes, it doesn't have that much impact. So the electors from each, whichever candidate wins the popular vote, except in Maine and Nebraska, they meet this year, it'll be Wednesday, December 14th in state capitals and in the District of Columbia to cast their electoral college votes. And those votes are then reported from the Secretary of State in each of the states in the District of Columbia to Washington. And the electoral college votes are truly certified. So we have a president-elect, and the media will say the popular vote is this, but we don't have an official popular vote in the United States. Weird, but true. So they'll say, well, this person's won by the end of November 3rd or early in the morning of November 4th, but that's actually the president-elect until January 6th. And that's when the president of the Senate, who's also the vice president of the United States, will count each individual vote, all 538, or until they get to a clear majority of 270. A candidate has to have 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency. And so they'll count, but they count all of the votes anyways. They have to. They count every single vote in before a joint session of Congress on January 6th. The date is fixed by law, so it would take another federal code to move it. So usually they'll do it on any day except a Sunday. In 2013, when they were counting the 2012 or certifying the 2012 presidential election results, they moved it from January 6th to January 7th, something along those lines. And so once the president of the Senate counts those votes, then the election is considered officially certified. Now, what happens, because this has happened in presidential history, what happens if there's no winner, if we don't get to 240 votes? Then the Constitution says that it goes to Congress. And so the president is chosen by the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote, and a simple majority of 26 is enough to win the presidency. So 26 states, their representative from the House has to vote for that candidate to be the president, and then the vice president is voted for in the Senate. And the president is picked in the House of Representatives because that's the body that's most closely tied to the people. They are elected, the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. They have much easier turnover than the Senate. The Senate has 6-year terms, and only 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years. And the Senate wasn't even directly elected by the people. It was chosen by the senators of each state were chosen by state legislatures until the ratification of the 17th Amendment in the 1920s in the progressive era in the US. So Kevin, why are winner-take-all systems allowed? Because the states allow them, and we haven't changed the electoral college system with an amendment. We can't get rid, because the electoral college is written into Article 2 of the Constitution, the only way to change it is through a constitutional amendment. And constitutional amendments are pretty hard to come by. That's why there's only been 27. And it requires 2/3 majority in Congress, not the House, not the Senate, but in Congress, there has to be a 2/3 majority to ratify an amendment, or there would have to be 3/4 majority of state legislatures. And there's only been one time that I can think of that we've had a national convention where the state legislatures have called for an amendment, and I believe that was prohibition, repealing prohibition. So it's just not very common. Most constitutional amendments come from Congress, but it still requires 2/3 majority of that body, and it takes a lot to get the House and the Senate to agree. 66%, even when one party dominates the other. I've seen a lot of news articles in the last few days that talk about what happens if Joe Biden wins the presidency and the Democrats control the House. What will happen? Will all these great things happen? Maybe. That's the short answer. the way that the founders created our government is that the legislative process is intended to be slow and deliberate. So they really think about what they're doing. And the other thing is, in a nation as geographically large and diverse as the United States, you could have people that all identify as being members of the Democratic Party, but they don't all ideologically agree on everything. You can have people that identify as being part of the Republican Party, and they're still going to agree fundamentally on a lot of different issues. That's one of the flaws with a two-party system. So the winner-take-all systems are allowed because the states haven't changed it, and we haven't had a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. And there are even news reports. The New York Times said in a poll that 61% of Americans favor getting rid of the Electoral College, but then when you break it down by party line, 89% of Democrats were in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College, where only 29% of Republicans were. Why might that be? Because when we look at maps, there's some other websites. One is 270towin.com and 538. 270 to Win is affiliated with the Center for Politics out of the University of Virginia. 538.com is affiliated with Nate Silver, who does a lot of statistical analyses to predict elections, and he's actually pretty accurate most of the time. But anyways, what they find is that most Republicans are out in more rural areas. And so if they were to get rid of the Electoral College, the urban, very heavily populated urban centers would basically run the country in terms of their voting. And so that's why there's a lot of reluctance, especially from states like Montana. Montana has 3 Electoral College votes. We don't talk about Montana on the national political scene really at all. And like first in the nation, one of the first primaries, the first caucus actually is Iowa. How often do we talk about Iowa? Every 4 years when they're going to be the first caucus, right? So does Iowa really want to get rid of that winner-take-all system? Do they want to lose their semi-importance every 4 years when people kind of pay attention to them a little bit? No, it's not really in the spirit of democracy, but there are reasons why people wouldn't want to get rid of it. And most urban, heavily densely populated areas of the United States tend to fall heavily Democratic, even in a state that is pretty, it has been for the last 30 years or so, that's typically pretty Republican, like Texas. When we look at our urban population centers, Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, those counties are very heavily blue, which is Democratic. They tend to vote very Democratic, but then you go out into more rural areas of Texas, and they are very, very red. And that is a good representative picture of how it functions in the rest of the country too. Large, urban, densely populated cities tend to be very Democratic, and more rural areas tend to be very Republican. And if you look at the platforms, that makes a lot of sense, because if you live in Montana or you live out in West Texas, where you're not likely to see another person, you know, for miles because there's a lot of agricultural land and ranches, then climate change and or pollution is not as big of a deal to you. But if you live in, like, let's say Manhattan or in the Bronx or in Brooklyn along the Hudson, and you see with all these population and pollution and all of that's going to be a much more important issue to you personally, depending on the geographic area of where you live. So a lot of it, and if you're a farmer, you're going to tend to support the Republican Party platform because they're talking about agricultural and being a voice and a representative of American agriculture. Whereas if you work in a building or you're a college professor or whatever, where you don't necessarily, those interests aren't that important to you. And if you don't think about how all of that, the agricultural work impacts, international trade or what goes to the grocery stores or what you have available to buy, then it's just not that important to you. And so that's really why some of these systems are still in place. One of the other system that's really interesting is that Americans tend to really like tradition in their politics. Like, yeah, the Electoral College is not that great, but why also don't we have term limits? Isn't that kind of against the spirit of democracy to have the same people in office over and over and over again? I mean, don't we get the same kind of policies from re-electing the same people? But that's another kind of quirky thing about American politics is we love to hate Congress as a whole. Congress is terrible, they're awful, but we tend to love our own personal representatives because they do things like credit claim. And when they pass some piece of legislation or they do something that benefits their constituents back home, they use federal money because it's allowed to send little postcards and say, hey, look, I voted for this recycle program. Love me. I mean, it's free campaign advertising. That's not what it is. It's just letting your constituents know that you did something that was helpful to them, but it's an added bonus that your competitors who aren't in office don't have. It also gives you name recognition, and name recognition in American politics is everything.
Yay.
True. Yeah. So that's all I have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Strunc. Appreciate that. Were we all in person, there'd be a rousing cheer, but instead we get, yeah, we can put little reactions up. Yeah, awesome. Nice job. We had a few questions in the chat. I think you were able to address those. If anyone wants to continue to ask Dr. Strunc questions, I am absolutely sure she would love to hear from you. And I'm guessing it's astrunk@tamet.edu. Is that right?
That is correct.
Right. So if you want to send congratulations, you can send them to me. If you want to send complaints, you can send them to her. So that is the value of being the chair. But thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it. Thank you, Abbie. For those of you who are of a hardy constitution, enjoy the presidential debate tonight. And yes, thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, well, Kevin, if you want to top that feeling off, just go ahead and watch the debate tonight.
Watch the debate. You'll feel great. I'm going to after possibly the entire bottle of port. I don't know. But okay. Thank you very much, folks. We will have another honors colloquium in, I believe, 2 weeks. Dr. Allard will be presenting on November 5th, and I will send out some information on that shortly. So, all right. Take care. See y'all later.